China is at the forefront of the biggest health disaster in modern times. A disaster so huge it has reshaped modern society, economies, cultures, and human lives forever. With the world focused on tackling the coronavirus pandemic, gleaming eyes focus on China, the soon-to-be largest economy in the world, and how they've responded to the pandemic. So China has pursued an elimination strategy, also known as the Zero-COVID strategy. This aims to eliminate local transmissions of the virus as early as possible. In theory, this will reduce the compounding effect of the virus, and thus its spread into the larger community. Initially, with the first COVID-19 variants, this approach was very successful, which reduced transmission to near zero within 18 months following the containment of the initial outbreak in Wuhan. Furthermore, the country during this period suffered just 2 COVID-19 related deaths, which is incredibly impressive. However, the question remains, will the zero-COVID strategy actually work with newer and more transmissible variants of the virus, in particular Omicron? Before I answer that question, it's good to know some context into exactly what is zero-COVID, how does it work? The China COVID-19 Emergency Response Team described its elimination strategy in a paper published in The Lancet in June 2020. When an infected person is identified, all close contacts are required to undergo a 14-day centralized quarantine with multiple rounds of PCR testing. During outbreaks, community-wide PCR testing is used to quickly identify infected people in order to rapidly isolate them from the general population and to allow a quicker return to normal activity. Community-wide screening was first trialled out in May 2020 in Wuhan and has been used in subsequent outbreaks in China. Depending on the city, additional measures may be employed. These include contact tracing, which is aided by the use of a smartphone application, and domestic travel restrictions in high-risk areas. Certain demographics may be also subject to compulsory PCR testing, including people with fever or respiratory symptoms, medical staff, and workers who handle imported goods. For example, in Beijing, there was a viral resurgence in June 2020 after 56 days without any known local transmission. The outbreak was centered around a wholesale market where neighborhood residents and their close contacts were tested. The outbreak was quickly brought to a halt by the 5th of July, less than a month after it began. In October 2020, after a period of 2 months without any known local infections in all of China, 3 new cases were detected in the port city of Qingdao. 2 dock workers with asymptomatic infections were identified as the probable source of the outbreak. The population of Qingdao was subsequently screened using pooled PCR testing, and 11 million people had been tested within 5 days of the first cases. Travel restrictions were imposed on the city, requiring people leaving the city to present a negative PCR test and to quarantine for at least a week. The outbreak was brought to an end without a lockdown. From July through to August 2021, China experienced and contained 11 outbreaks of the Delta variant. The largest of these outbreaks began in Nanjing, which was traced back to an infected passenger on a flight to Moscow. The outbreak spread to multiple provinces before it was contained to manageable levels. However, China did not fully eliminate viral transmission in the community. After the lockdown of Wuhan, the overall consensus in top academic journals such as Science Magazine, Nature, The Lancet regarded China's measures to contain the virus as highly effective. One study published in Science magazine concluded that the Wuhan travel ban may have prevented more than 700,000 cases outside the city. Furthermore, a survey on seroprevalence found that seroprevalence fell with distance from Wuhan, indicating that the initial outbreak has been contained outside of the city. On the other hand, a commentary article in Global Public Health examined the possibility of inaccurate death counts due to alleged political censorship. The authors concluded that due to a lack of any known deaths of Hong Kong or Taiwan residents in mainland China, the discrepancy between official and the true death toll is particularly not large. The reaction from global leaders have been largely positive. For example, US President Donald Trump thanked Xi Jinping on Twitter, stating that China has been working very hard to contain the coronavirus. However, he later rebuked his comments, saying that he was a little upset with China and that the country was very secretive, and that's unfortunate. Current US President Joe Biden would later say that Trump failed to hold China accountable on coronavirus. In the first half of 2020, US intelligence officials and the British government expressed doubts about the accuracy of the figures provided by the Chinese government. This raised concerns that China has been deliberately underreporting the extent of infections and deaths. And on April 1st, 2020, two United States officials said that China had deliberately concealed its cases and death rates. The anonymous officials stated that the Chinese central government does not know the extent of the outbreak because lower tier officials reportedly falsified statistics to avoid losing their positions. Since mid-February in 2022, China has faced an unprecedented Omicron wave, with daily cases reaching record highs since the pandemic started 2 years ago. Zero COVID-19 measures were redeployed in Shenzhen, Shenyang and Jilin. Other areas such as Shanghai have adopted a less strict approach, avoiding wholesale lockdowns only to issue a snap lockdown in late March. These measures have seen a rare pushback from residents over the implementation and the perceived lack of benefits. So this is the part of the video where I could have a little fun and freedom and give you my raw, unfiltered opinion on how I think China has responded to the coronavirus pandemic. Now initially, during the first 18 months of the coronavirus pandemic, in my opinion, China has done a fantastic job, especially with the zero-COVID policy. Why? Because during that time, we didn't know anything about the coronavirus. We didn't know its mechanism of action. We did not know whether it spread from human to human. And on top of that, the initial iterations of the virus tended to be a lot more deadlier and also less transmissible. And therefore, the zero-COVID strategy was actually justified. It made sense. They're able to identify these cases very early on and eliminate them at the source, and thus minimize the economic impact that it will have by preventing it from spreading into the larger community. However, I am a little bit more skeptical on whether or not the zero-COVID strategy will work into the future, particularly with Omicron. Now, most scientists or analysts or media journalists will say, well, it makes sense. Of course it's not going to work because Omicron is a lot more transmissible, it's a lot less deadlier, and therefore it has lower health benefits in order to implement this zero-COVID strategy, right? However, I'm also skeptical of that opinion. Now, I think they're missing a very crucial aspect of China, and that is China has a very weak medical system. Their medical system has very low capacity. If you look at it from the number of beds they only have 4 beds per 1,000 people and 1.8 doctors per 1,000. That is very tiny compared to something like the UK or the US, which have far more beds and far more doctors. And on top of that, if you look at the vaccination rates of China, yes, it's higher than the UK. It's at 83.3% compared to 75% here in the UK. But if you look at the unvaccinated people, the demographics of them, they tend to be older people in China. Older people don't want to take the vaccine in China because they're skeptical of Western medicine, because they're skeptical of taking the vaccine. Now, this is extremely problematic because the elderly are the vulnerable people. They're the ones at risk of actually dying or having severe health complications. Now, if China were to ease any restrictions now, this would cause a significant amount of cases, and that will cause a significant amount of deaths, and that will overload their weak medical system, which would cause untold health consequences for the country. Not only will Omicron and coronavirus rise, but also other diseases like cancer. Now, my opinion is that China will still continue to pursue this zero-COVID strategy. Why? Because it's the only option they have. They don't have a medical system in order to burden the coronavirus pandemic. What they need to do right now is to ensure that there's enough education, particularly for the elderly people, to actually take the vaccine, to take a double jab. And that's gonna take time. And effectively what the zero-COVID strategy is doing is, one, scaring people into taking the vaccine, and two, this is actually buying them time to effectively putting a marketing campaign out there to educate people. Now, in the long term, China needs to invest into its medical facilities. They need to build more hospitals, they need to hire more doctors, they need to hire more nurses to ensure that they can keep up with the demand. This is a very crucial moment in China's history. They're the second largest economy in the world, and they're projected to become the #1 economy in 7 years' time. Now, a lot of their economic growth is driven by human capital, and if that human capital, if those people who are working in China are ill, if people are aging, this is not only going to cause an economic burden, but this is also going to cause a massive healthcare crisis. In terms of their medical capacity right now, it is insufficient to ensure that their growth is sustainable in the long term. They managed to meet these criteria, investing in their healthcare and also protecting vulnerable people, not only will this increase their legitimacy to Western countries out there, but also this will ensure that the people are happy with them to ensure that the Chinese government continues to stay in power. Okay, rant over. Now, I hope you learned something new today and I hope you enjoyed that video. I had a lot of fun creating this, by the way. Now, if you did, please give us a like, a subscribe and ring that notification bell. And if you want to read more China insights, then check out our website ChineseAlpha.com, where we write about the Chinese business environment on a weekly basis. Till then, stay safe.